Welcome everybody back to the Smart Park podcast, where we explore ideas, innovations, and real-world lessons shaping the future of destinations, water, surf, and active entertainment. I'm Julie Klein from Aquatic Development Group, and today's episode is all about one of the most important factors of water park design and operations, safety. To dive into why smart parks are safe parks, I'm joined by Wess Long from Starguard Elite. Welcome, Wess.
Hi, thank you.
Hi. So just to set the stage, I know we've known you a long time. We're working on a project actively together, but for our listeners that might not know Starguard Elite, can you give us a little background of what the company does and what role they play in the aquatics industry?
Yeah, for sure. So Starguard Elite, we are an aquatic safety agency. Training certification programs is kind of the core of what we do. We have over 400 organizations we work with around the world that we set up as training centers. They train lifeguards as the primary role, with lots of other first responder management, attraction operation, things of that nature. So that's kind of the core of what we do. But then we do a lot of risk prevention, consulting, regulatory compliance, other advisory, traction commissioning, things of that nature. Anything really to do with safety operations or regulatory is kind of where we focus. And the idea is that, we see a lot of different organizations and operations, and there are definite standards, there's best practices. And so we help clients figure out, okay, what's applicable to them, what the best route to get there, training their teams and setting up all those other layers of risk prevention to hopefully, provide fun, but not have anyone any claims or any injuries or God forbid drownings, things like that.
Absolutely. Well, when you look at, your different programs and when you're meeting a client for the first time, what would you say some of the largest misconceptions are about safety programs, lifeguard training?
I think for people that aren't in the industry, that are kind of, they know a little bit about, the space, but not really haven't lived and breathed it, is understanding all the layers that go into it. We have a lot of times where someone's like, I just didn't get my lifeguard certified. And you're like, okay, great. That's an important layer of that risk prevention model. However, there's all these other things, right? From the staffing plans and the emergency equipment, the policies and procedures, all of these other components add up into that and make it sustainable. But the management involvement, engagement, understanding of and acceptance of that, because the training piece is important, but that's only one sliver of the pie.
Well, and when you say all those different pieces, it can start to probably feel overwhelming to an operator that isn't in the space or has never been involved in it. So, working with a company like yours to kind of take out some of that initial stress and all the findings that you guys have already learned from, right? Why make the same mistakes that other parks have already made in the past?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see a lot is individuals will say, well, we're going to be different, or they kind of want to go down a path that, you're like, guys, if we go down this path, I promise you we're going to have this, or this, or a lot of times we can preempt, correct them or get them on a different path through, we know what insurance companies are going to look for. We know what some of the health regulators and various inspectors, or, certain, like in the US, certain states have rides divisions, they only allow certain, they have restrictions and requirements on their side. In other countries, there's other similar types of mechanisms in place, or sometimes it's the ASTM or EN standards or whatever. But so we try to help educate the client, understanding these are the ways to do it. But a lot of times it's just people hear safety, they start hearing all these other things, and they see dollar signs, and they're not necessarily return on investment dollar signs. But it's requirements in certain places. So there's a lot of that kind of that educational component that goes into it as well.
Well, actually, it's funny you say that, because my first thought was you might not see a direct ROI on your safety investment, but you also have to think, having your staff properly trained, you have to have a return on guest experience, because all of a sudden your staff making sure that they're following safety protocols not only makes your space feel safer, but it also must make for a better guest experience in some way, correct?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, you think about even like just in a broader context, if a shopping mall has a safety incident, God forbid, something happened. People don't want to go shop there. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you think about theme parks, water parks, attractions, any of this, there's a beach that's notorious for having incidents occur. People stop going there. Right.
You-
And so in this space, not only is it, is it vital in that, from that perspective of you want consumer confidence and everything like that, but the financial stability and sustainability of like the long term of that years later, or sometimes people they remember, and there becomes a perception. And so those components on the front end, preventing those from ever happening and or demonstrating like, hey, we really want a safe operation. We're doing all these things. People see it. We had a client just a couple days ago that they had guest feedback. A young girl at a medical event. The team responded and did a great job. And she was like, I saw them around all week, but when I saw them jump into action, she's like, it just really, really gave me a lot of confidence. And now I feel even better about coming back to your facility because of, how serious you guys take it and yada, yada. But like the point being is that while there's not a direct ROI, oftentimes there is absolutely a cost if you don't do it and something happens. And so that's, again, finding that balance of having all those measures in place, but not being so overbearing or financially burdensome that it hurts the business from that perspective.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I'm going to dive into a lot more topics, but before we get into it, I would love to kind of understand a bit about your journey and how you got with Starguard. I know you've worked in some really recognizable destinations. You've worked with Walt Disney World and you've worked at Atlantis the Palm. And I would just kind of love to understand, what your career journey was like and how those different milestones really shaped your education and experience in the safety world.
Yeah. So for me, yeah, definitely was never intended to be a career, right? Like a lot of us in the space. I was going to the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I played competitive golf growing up. I was working at a really nice country club, and I heard a radio ad for Walt Disney World was hiring lifeguards for their water parks, and I remember reflecting my own childhood memories, being like, I loved water parks. Oh, it sounds fun, whatever. And just a curious phone call. Next thing you know, I was in an interview, was signed up for training class, and I was hired at Blizzard Beach. And, and I kind of started there. And I guess the bug kind of bit me, so to speak, where I like really enjoyed the environment, and spent a few years through college at Disney, got into some of the frontline management and everything there. And then when I graduated, I said, I'm going to be in the IT, .coms were blowing up at the time, late 90s. And I did that very briefly. And then I had an opportunity to come back to the industry or trying to kind of get a full-time career in the industry. And then from there, I started working at water parks, and, I went from San Jose, California to Dubai and opened the Atlantis, the Palm there, back to California, worked for, and then what happened was I joined a management company, and we partnered with Starguard, and basically said, hey, you have a great training program. We think there's an opportunity to build this into like a bigger company and do more with this program. And so Starguard Elite, about 2014, was born, if you will. And then in 2018, or 2018, we formed it into its own company around the Starguard program. And so we've been off and running, and, we focus on, we have a lot of clients, a little over 50% of our clients are public organizations, cities, parks and rec, counties, things like that. And then the other half are private sector. And then of that, we have we work with a lot of water parks and cruise lines and resorts and surf parks and, kind of everything in between. And so we take a really kind of objective based and standards based approach to everything because they're so different. But
Sure.
we've really looked at spaces like surf, cruise line, Caribbean, places that have like not a lot of great support as from a safety industry perspective, and said, hey, what can we do to kind of be that partner in this space? And that's largely kind of how we've grown and evolved over the years.
So when you look at how many people are a part of Starguard Elite, I mean, you're touching so many different industries. You're all over the world. I mean, how are you doing it with how many people do you have?
Our full-time team is 12
Okay.
within my staff. Now we outsource a lot of our back office, our HR and our accounting and our web development and such. I like to say on a given day, we probably have about, 16 to 20 staff that wake up every day, kind of focused on startup related activities. We have an amazing a team of contractors that work with us, some very part-time, some are pretty much full-time with us. And that's about another 25 or 30. So in all, we have probably about 40 to 45 people that on a daily basis that are doing something for us in some capacity. But largely with our full-time team, like that's really where, they're just amazing. And the work that we're able to deliver through them is really, really been something else.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, when you look at dealing with different countries and different areas of the world, I mean, even in the United States, you think about how different legislation and regulatory constraints are between Florida and California and all these different states, right? We deal with it all the time. When you're looking at the aquatic space, how do you deal with looking at your training and your safety protocols for all these different markets internationally and domestically?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's something that it's really interesting to, a lot of it obviously depends on where you're starting from. Some countries like Australia, most of Europe, things like that, they have pretty established standards and practices themselves. So you have to educate yourself on those. When you go into some of the emerging markets, like in areas like the Caribbean and Middle East and whatever, some of them have certain codes and then some of them don't. So like in the Caribbean, they look to a lot of American standards. And so we're able to say, well, in the US, this is what we do. And there's a bit of a, of a kind of determination, what's applicable, what isn't, and advisable and all that stuff. When we go to places like Europe, we have to, really understand the standards, the EN standards, for example, or some of the per country requirements there. And so everywhere is a little bit different. But that's just one of those that you start as you work on some projects you learn and you say, okay, well, we're doing this here. We're kind of borrowing, stealing, if you will, from different, different comparable projects. And that often plays, helps in a lot of ways. But then sometimes we have clients like we work with the Starguard group in Mexico, and they are phenomenal. They're just incredible people, incredible facilities, and everything that we do in like so many other sectors doesn't apply there. So a lot of that, it's like, okay, we're creating really brand new types of standards or expectations, or through consensus, we're figuring out what we think the best routes are. And that approach is largely what we've done in most of these other markets.
I was going to say, even beyond geographical, you talked about so many different, industry segments that you work with, right? Like cruise ships versus
Yeah.
water parks versus municipal versus private, and they all have to be treated slightly different. So how do you even manage some of these new industries like, the surf park market compared to the cruise ship market? How are you handling adapting some of your typical safety protocols to these new markets that really, they might be different, they might be a sport, they might have different rules and regulations. They don't all function the same way.
Yeah, it's surf parks are a great example, right? Where we're bringing a lot of ocean life-saving expertise into the surf park traveling basins in particular, which is great, because when you start talking about large surf basins, they are not like a water park wave pool at all, right? The rips, the waves, the bathymetry of the basins and everything is so different. And so it needs a lot of that ocean life-saving expertise. However, from a regulatory perspective and operations perspective, it's often like geared more closer to like water parks, for example, in terms of how they state, or a health official or someone might be looking at it, because it is an artificial body. And that's where you really have to take a hybrid approach of saying, okay, we apply this here, these swimming pool standards apply, but these don't. These, this ocean life-saving techniques apply, but these don't, and from like a surveillance perspective, from a operations, a water flow and everything. And while surf parks are, they create a lot of unique challenges, they also have a lot of advantages from a safety perspective, where you have this massive basin that has a really highly kind of structured flow of participant usage, and everyone has a flotation device, and so there is some controllability to it. And from that perspective, versus open water, open swim bodies of water like an artificial lagoon, can be so different. And so I think a lot of it is really, first and foremost for us, it's like, what's the anticipated guest experience? What are we trying to accomplish? So we want to try to have safety standards without taking away from the guest experience. But then we start looking at, okay, what's definitely applicable, what's advisable, what are the other best practices and such. And you take that kind of hybrid approach of looking at it. And so that's why, you can't take a McDonald's hamburger here and say cruise line lifeguards, surf park lifeguards, resort, open water resort lifeguards, and just try to apply the same thing. It won't work.
No, because not only is the standard not the same, but to your point about understanding what the goal of the experience is to achieve, it also reminds me of this: the lifeguard you might hire for a surf basin might be very different than the lifeguard you need for a water park, just depending on the conditions and what you're looking to achieve in that experience. So I think it's really interesting to look at the hybrid approach. And then what's the risk? Like, if this one size doesn't fit all, what is the risk if we determine that this experience doesn't need to fit that qualification?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So when you look at projects, when you're brought into projects, or you offer your services out, how does it typically work? Is it that you get involved and start working on the operational and safety planning from obviously before the park opens, because you want to train the staff, but how soon do you like to get involved in the process?
Well, I mean, for us personally, like most projects where we've been involved, even from like the concept or early design stages, has proven to be really valuable. We did a large water park project that should hopefully be opening here the next year or two. They're moving dirt, which is great. But the design of it, just by looking at the design, we were able to move some change the layout and some of the attractions on pencil, if you will. And I think we say 14 to 16 labor, future lifeguard and attendant roles and things like that, just by tweaking it. And we didn't change the guest experience, but things like sight lines, some of the spacing, if you will, like a great example is lazy rivers. Lazy rivers, if you put an island in a lazy rivers, they can serve purpose, but sometimes what happens is you start talking about industry standards for sight lines and coverage and stuff like that. It becomes very different, or becomes very challenging, and you can suddenly add, a huge number of staff to your payroll that's not necessary. With a few tweaks. Some of it is the, positioning, like, for example, they had a rock wall, deep water, but it was really close to like a children's area. And we're like, wait a second, there wasn't enough barriers and things in between. This is a potential issue. So being involved early stage, a lot of times we can help save long-term headache, and labor and such down the line. Then also a lot of times just planning for different, requirements, because sometimes if we're brought in later on a project, we're like, hey, this is great, but, we did a project, they had a nice, really beautiful action river, but they wanted to have, they had this vision of like being in like a canyon, and they wanted to be like really high walls where there was nowhere to be like safely respond. Right. Yeah. And to be able to get in and out and all that. And so we were able to like achieve what the client wanted, however, do it. And so it would be compliant and meet the safety standards and all those things. So being early more often than not, we have very limited role early on. And then as it starts going operational development, things like sometimes even recruiting management and helping build out policies and procedures and such. We have a lot of role in that, introducing other suppliers, whether it's emergency equipment or sometimes even like furnishings and things, we're in a fortunate position where we see a lot of operations. And, if someone's like, hey, this product, so-and-so's selling me this product, what do you think? We like, well, I've seen that product actually. Here's some pros and cons to that, or here's other alternatives to it. And just having that network, the project we're working on, there was some conversations about helmets and use of helmets in surf parks and things like that. And through some contacts that I had, like, oh, hey, this is what they're raving about a certain product, right? And we're like, oh, cool, make that introduction. So there's a lot of that type of stuff that we're able to do. Of course, if a project's built and already operating, we can come in and then still do, a lot of training and support. But short, we do a lot of consulting early on, and then it turns into just ongoing training, support, safety audits, things like that, once it's operating.
I was going to say, so it's great because not only are you doing the training, but you can play an advisory role early. And not only will you help be able to save operational dollars, but if you think about it, in the example of a lazy river, we talk about it all the time. We actually have a diagram, like, the design river. If you were just thinking about design, how wonky it would be and twisty and overcomplicated because it would be fun, right? Then you put your builder hat on and you're like, okay, well, the more complicated I make this, the more money it's going to cost the client. And then you put your operator hat on and you're like, well, crap, that's going to need 30 lifeguards, right? And so you kind of have to marry all three of those when you're building or designing in a plan. And so to have somebody that's a voice of reason and can do that checks and balances early, not only will help you on operational dollars, but it'll help you on your project dollars as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that sometimes, we really truly try to take the approach of what is your vision for the guest experience and how can we accomplish that vision without coming in and being like, oh, no, you got to cut all this, take all this fun out, ADG has all these amazing ideas, but you're not allowed to incorporate any. No, it's like, okay, how can we tweak some of these things, or what are some small modifications? We're working on a project with you guys that is doing a water park expansion, and they're putting in almost 4 different experiences in the same body of water, if you will. But the segmentation of those is really important, because so we're having conversations and tweaking the plan a little bit to say, okay, we factor in this, we do this. And when you can have those conversations early on, it makes the whole experience better. Long term, it's easier to get approvals from inspectors, and there's less safety concerns and all of this can be a real pain.
Absolutely. You talked about safety audits and long-term training and support. So just so I understand, somebody might bring you on, you might help develop their plan. That could be the end of the scope and you call it a day. But you also could provide training services. And then do you come back every year? Or how do you determine how often you need to re-up your training?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. So most of training organizations, we train the trainers, and they have the ability of training their staff, issuing certifications for a broad range of programs. Most of it, again, is emergency first responder based. And then what we do is, so some clients, it really depends on the business. A lot of our seasonal clients in the U.S., they operate May to September, right? And so a lot of them, we're doing audits in June, July, and August. So we'll do 3 unannounced visits for them. We'll come in and we do observations of the lifeguards, the slide attendants, the deck supervisors. We do some skills assessments. We look at documentation. For other year-round type clients, a lot of them are doing them more like quarterly. And then we have some clients that we do, some of the international clients, especially, we do 1 or 2 visits a year with them as kind of like a retraining, and we do a site assessment. So it kind of depends on the type of operation and some of the feasibility of doing the audits and everything like that. But everyone's different, but generally most clients get between 2 to 4 audits a year, depending on length of season and the scope of their operation and such. And what that does is we take a very mentoring approach. It's not just kind of like a health inspector coming in and here's my long list, check, check, check. We come in, we evaluate the operation. We try to, say, hey, here's all the good things we're seeing. Here's opportunities for improvement. And always trying to, push that bar. Like even our clients that are just, outstanding performers year in, year out, we're always still looking at ways of saying, hey, are there things you could be doing or things, you need to be preparing for? And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the industry. So that ability to see and be part of the operation and not just, here's a textbook.
Here's your manual.
Yeah, here it is. Go, you figure it out. Really, really makes it for a lot more effective long-term strategy and goal building and such. And it's worked really well.
Well, you brought up 2 points that it just kind of hit me is, you think about the long-term training and the importance of that in an industry where turnover is exceptionally high. You're seeing a lot of parks being acquired by other entities. I mean, we've seen so many changes in our aquatic space in the last 2 years, 3 years. Mm-hmm. And, just thinking about that knowledge is gone a lot of the times when the people leave or it's not transferred properly. I mean, we've even seen it with different parks and, you not knowing how they should be backwashing their filter, what they should be doing with adding media, right? And I think that you start to see this ongoing need for, okay, well, how can we touch base to help you so that you're being safe, you're being compliant, you're being, the way the ride or the experience was intended to be used.
Yeah, I mean the staff turnover in our industry is a huge issue. I'm not a huge issue, but it's a big challenge in the sense that there's so much knowledge that ends up becoming lost, right? Mm-hmm. Because someone's there for a long time and then they leave, and there's maybe not a big enough bench, and so that's one of the areas that we're always trying to see what we can do to influence clients. Be like, be thinking about their bench, right? What are if this person leaves, who's the next person behind, right? And so like we do that from our training programs. We have some things that are kind of unique to us where we develop. Here's your core instructors. Here's your next generation of instructors, and getting them in the so you have that pipeline of in case you do get that turnover. But that being said, the nature of the space, the seasonality of it, it's part of it, right? Where especially for a lot of these seasonal facilities, retaining staff at the level they need, 365 days a year is tough if they don't have other functions and duties for them. And so some of our public parks and rec, the summertime, the aquatics manager, director in the fall and winter is doing other things, throughout the city, and that works well. Some of the seasonal facilities, they're doing maintenance or they're doing other things, and then some of them it's a summer job, they're school teachers, right? They teach at one time of the year and they run a pool in the other. So everyone's just different in that space. But what we try to do is foster safety cultures, that there's people in place, because there's always some people returning, right? And so the more we can build on that and have those systems in place, but also make them practical and foster like what do you absolutely need to know? Okay, here's the nice to knows, and make the systems make sense. And I joke because I'm always with our team and clients and such. I'm like, if you're reading something and like one of our advice and something doesn't make sense, like ask the question. Like we've pulled out a lot of stuff or really been like, how can we simplify things? Because it's easy to be like, here's the 500-page manual. Oh, it's in the fine print. You figure it out. But it's not that doesn't set anyone up for success, especially in high turnover industry like we have.
100%. And I also think the other comment that I really appreciated is going and seeing how people are using the space. And you said, the industry is changing. There's more technology being introduced. There's immersive experience. There's surf and water parks. There's, lights and music and all the different things that are being introduced into the space that, once you start to see how people are using the area or using it, you can tailor. And I think that's the beautiful thing that you're saying is like, it's ongoing training because it's always evolving and there's always ways that you can make it better.
Yeah, no doubt. We've for about 10 years now, we've had like hashtag evolve, because we're always, that mindset of us is with us and our clients. It's like, hey, listen, we're going to constantly, hopefully, be introducing new technology, new ways of doing things, because the industry is always growing and evolving. We need to evolve as well.
Mhm.
Technology, we see it being used from the types of attractions and the experiences that are being delivered by, whether it's a slide manufacturer, a surf manufacturer, you mentioned lighting and other, type of, auxiliary, if you will, entertainment and such around these spaces, ways to engage the spaces, pool designs, I mean, some of the crazy pool designs that we see at times, that are so cool, and they're incorporating different technology. There's also technology on the other side from a operations perspective. Like, there's some incredible surveillance, using some of these AI systems, right? From surveillance of your patrons, surveillance looking for drowning. We're working on some other, kind of device-based technologies, and such. And so, because some technology is very applicable in certain environments, others works really well in other environments, like in the surf space, the cameras for the experience and the ability to record all of your waves, but then go through and pick out your highlights and create a highlight reel, and all this,
Yeah.
like, through the AI and the facial recognition, and all. It's incredible at what's out there. And so there's all these different technologies in space. So from our perspective, on the safety and operations side, we're always looking at, okay, what's new in terms of either impacting general, standards, and how do you apply this, right? Maybe from the attraction technology itself. On the other side, it's like from a safety and response, AEDs, for example, they've largely been the same for, 20 plus years. However, there are evolving, there is evolution in that space. And so making sure we stay up on that. Just last year, one of our clients created a new type of rescue tube, and now it's all over the place, and it's a new material, different, different functionality and such. But there's these types of innovations are happening. And so when we try to help be a conduit of both understanding what's happening, but be educating, our clients on how to, how to incorporate it or manage it or whatever it needs to be.
It's funny. You brought up utilizing like technology for safety and operations. And I was thinking about, I've seen technologies where there's like lifeguard eye and it's like using AI, right? Very cool. And it was funny. I was actually having a conversation with somebody the other day about the pros and cons of technology. And it was funny. We were talking about like a GPS, and you rely on the GPS so much that half the time I'm like, I don't even know what road I was on, right? I just followed the line to get there. And, I was having a conversation with somebody. It's like, it's not that you forgot, you don't know how to drive anymore, but like you're so reliant on the technology sometimes that you don't need the skill of being like, okay, let me navigate my way there, right? That eliminated the need for it for a lot of people. So when you apply that to the water park space, do you have any concerns or thoughts on when we start to implement some of these safety technologies, that ensuring that it's more of a secondary measure, not the primary measure?
Yeah, I think a good, I tell people all the time, we know they're more common, mainstream. There's some regulatory hurdles or some other things that have to be figured out, but the confidence in that technology is getting better every day. But it's kind of like automated, full self-driving cars, right? Where yes, the technology's there, it's largely functioning. However, it's still prone to some error. One of my concerns would be that we get to a point where the cameras are there and we just kind of stop, like, oh, let the camera do all the work.
The camera, yeah.
Right. And there's so many unique variables in kind of what we do. But, listen, if we're going to be able to figure out cars just drive themselves and get around, like, we can figure it out around the aquatic space, and we will in time, and that'll change the dynamic. But that type of technology is still a layer in that risk prevention, because while it might identify, being able to perform, provide care, perform rescues, do some of these other things, is going to become, it's going to take a long time before some of that could be put into technology as well. So it's an evolving thing. I think it's one of those where we're relying on it and we want to rely on it, but on the flip side, we also have to use our what's practically in front of us, right? With our medical doctors that are our medical directors, we talk a lot about, well, there's this technology for this, and they're like, well, what do your eyes see? What are your, like,
Yeah.
are you seeing the chest rise and fall? Are you feeling a pulse? Like, what is the person actually telling you? Because some of that is still better than some of the technical options out there. So it's always a balance, right? But it is absolutely continuing to grow and become more and more commonplace to the point that we will have a day that pretty much the expectation is you have a swimming pool, you have a camera, and it's watching. That's not we're not there today.
We're not there today. Yep, absolutely. When you look at some of the words, the buzzwords that go around the industry of like compliance versus, proactive safety, how do you differentiate the two pieces and what an operator can do to not just be compliant, but to look at proactive safety in their park?
I think probably one of my best analogies of that is a market like Las Vegas. So the Nevada Health District has some very specific guidance for how facilities operate, right? And there are expectations for staffing plans and for having certain training and other operational procedures and such. You can be compliant but still not necessarily be proactive to be preventative. And in that we see that there's a lot of organizations that check boxes. They're training their lifeguards. They have people positioned as the regulations require. They have some of the procedures in place. What they don't have is they don't have engaged management. They don't have engaged staff. They by checking the boxes, yes, they've added some of those layers, but they're not really engaged, and there's not a real culture of safety and everything that needs to be in place. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is someone coming in and saying, well, no, I got my certificate or I got this, like, okay, that you got that, but there's without like that management kind of oversight and engagement and all these other and the culture and people buying into what they do, being compliant doesn't necessarily make you proactive. And the places that do it are some of them just do just such an incredible job of from day one, right? Employees join it, and you're part of when Disney, immediately had a sense of like belonging and purpose, and we took a lot of like people really like took a lot took it very serious, versus maybe what we see at other places where it's just kind of like, oh yeah, get your certificate, go out there, do the, it's very nonchalant and ultimately just it's really in a position it's more reactive than it is proactive.
And I think anytime you can be proactive, you'll create a culture with your team and your staff that really truly believes it and wants to be a part of it, wants to learn and educate themselves on how they can really be more safe and provide a better experience. So versus reactive and everybody panicking of what are we supposed to do? What's actually supposed to happen in this situation?
Yeah, the mindset of doing the bare minimum, right? Just being like, oh, we're doing this because we have to, not because necessarily we believe in it. I think is a big deal.
Absolutely. Well, let's say if we had to give one piece of advice to kind of end it up, if we had to give one piece of advice to an operator on something that they could implement within their team tomorrow, what would you say is your biggest piece of advice?
I suppose it would be a little bit dependent on who's my audience, right? But if I'm talking to like an owner operator manager of a facility, I think probably the biggest thing would be like how engaged are they at all levels? And and the organizations that really do a great job, it yes, they're checking all those boxes. They have the training programs and the equipment and the policies and procedures, but they have a ownership or management or some sort of leadership that is engaged, that's supporting it, that's mentoring it, and really believing in that cultural kind of component, if you will, and not just saying, you figure it out, or not supporting their team teams. And so that starts at the top, you know, but I think that probably more than anything, it would be that. It would be like just whatever you can do, because if you have that level of engagement and you know all the other requirements, then that'll start to build that culture and that overall that real preventative mindset within the organization.
I love that. I think that's a great ending piece of advice. Well, Wes, is there anything, any final words or anything that you didn't get to say that you want to end on? Or
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and just thank you for what you guys do, and it's great to be able to work on different projects together and see all that's going on in the space. But yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity.
absolutely, it was great having you on, and I'm sure all of our listeners thoroughly enjoyed it. But again, everybody, it's Wess Long from Starguard Elite.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.